this new OECD webinar on innovative methods for the assessment of social and emotional skills. I want to start by thanking our panelists for accepting our invitation and to our audience as well for your presence and your interest in being part of this exciting discussion. My name is Daniel Catarino da Silva, and I'm part of the social and emotional skills team here at the OECD, and together with my colleague Adriano Linzarini, we will be presenting OECD's most recent work on this topic, and then we'll moderate the discussion with our excellent panel. Last January, we promoted a webinar to discuss the importance of social and emotional skills and pedagogical strategies to teach them effectively. In today's session, we will turn our minds to assessment, specifically to explore the different innovations we can use to assess these skills. We know, of course, that measuring social and emotional skills is essential to obtain the necessary information about students' strengths and challenges, and only with high quality, rigorous measurement, we are able to identify the needs of the students and also ensure that any social and emotional interventions we implement in schools are actually effective. The problem is that so far we have mostly used a limited portfolio of instruments which do not capture the complexity of behaviors associated with these skills. So today we'll be looking at innovative methods to overcome this issue, as well as discussing how more advanced technologies like virtual reality, biodata, and artificial intelligence in particular can improve the ability to measure social and emotional skills. And of course, we'll also debate the ethical concerns and data issues that these technologies also bring. So to help us discuss these new findings and think about the future of education and how we can best embrace it, we have invited a great panel of experts. They have different backgrounds and professional experiences, and so these different perspectives that they will bring will help us analyze innovations in assessment through vivid discussion. So I have the pleasure of introducing Rose Luckin, who is Emeritus Professor at University College London and founder and CEO of Education Ventures Foundation. Hi, Rose. A company that provides training and consultancy to the education sector to help them leverage AI ethically and effectively. Being a recognized academic with expertise on AI in education, Rose served as an advisor to policymakers, governments, and industry around the world. So we welcome you. We also have Clemens Lechner, and I hope I'm saying that right, who is an expert in psychological assessment and educational technology and currently works as Chief Product Officer at Jam Technology. Clemens has more than 10 years of academic research experience on topics such as measurement, statistical modeling, and development of skills and personality. And he has also worked on AI applications in education and training. And last but not least, of course, we also have with us Alan Morgan, who has a background in developmental studies, social policy, and mental health, and who's currently the principal advisor for the Global Innovations for Character Development Initiative with the Templeton Foundation. At Templeton, Alan supports the identification, development, and evaluation of high potential research and implementation projects related to this initiative for character development. Welcome, Alan. So we are going to start our discussion today with a short presentation on OECD's recent work on mapping and reviewing innovative assessment tools. And after this brief introduction, then we can kick off our discussion with our panel. Many of you have already submitted a lot of questions in advance, so thank you for your interest, but you're also more than welcome to leave questions in our chat, since we intend to pick a couple of them at the end to discuss with our panel. So I will now try to share my slides. Let's see. Second, okay. Let's see if I can put this in. Okay. You can see this properly, I hope. Yes, right. Okay, so in this first part, as I said, we're going to focus on behavioral-based assessments. So, and let's start by sorry, a second. Okay, let us start by understanding why innovation is so critical. As I said in my introduction, we need to monitor social-emotional development to identify the strengths and challenges with student skills so that we can improve teaching and pedagogical practices. And for this, we need robust, valid, and comparable assessments. And the problem is that we currently rely mostly on self-reported and teacher-reported questionnaires, which of course offer valuable information and insights, but they're also an indirect measure of assessment and they carry multiple biases. So yes, the information is valuable, but it's also limited. we also know, and we need to expand the portfolio of available assessments. We also know that many skills are better assessed in action. Skills like empathy, assertiveness, or collaboration are better assessed in our interactions with different tasks or different people, rather than asking people how they think or how much they think they are empathetic or assertive. So that's why we are looking for behavioral assessments that can flesh out more authentic behaviors, looking at choices and actions while doing certain tasks. And so we can obtain more objective and comparable data to measure social and emotional skills. So what did we do in this work? We mapped almost 60 different tasks in digital games, and they collectively can assess 20 different social and emotional skills. Of course, with the caveat that there's an uneven distribution in this coverage. For some skills, we only have one instrument, while for others, we found more than 10 different assessment tools. And we have also reviewed these tools against 3 different major criteria. The first is ecological validity, which relates to the representativeness of this tool, tool or task. So, for example, whether the task offers complex audiovisual stimuli, whether it adapts to students' actions, whether it provides open answer responses instead of just fixed answers. Validity and reliability can refer to the fact that the tool, the results of the tool match the results of already other established tools, or they can predict the outcomes of children in academic success or pro-social behaviors, for example. And the other criteria, feasibility, has to do with, for example, how much time a tool requires to be administered, if we require specialized stuff, or whether grading, for example, is automatic or requires manual work. So we have written a working paper with a lot more detailed information, but we've also produced this interactive online table with very accessible information that you can use to compare, contrast the different tools. In this table, we offer you information on the 57 different assessment tools we've reviewed, giving you information again on sources, what type of skills they assess, the target age, the countries and languages in which they've been tested, and of course, how they fare in each of this criteria. And you can navigate through the table in an interactive way. You have the link on the chat, and you also will receive a link in the email after this webinar. It's very difficult to give you representative examples of tasks and digital games because they're all so different. But just so you know, we've conceptualized a task as having a simple interface with direct instructions to the students, while digital games are more complex, usually have a social narrative, and we embody characters to play through a story. But so just to give you an example of each, this is Creia, is a task to assess creativity. On the left, here, students or people in general are asked to produce, from a certain number of tiles, asked to produce original shapes of digits or dogs, for example. And on the right, to assess a different part of creative thinking, you're asked to select the starting point to reach this final image in the most efficient way. On the right, you have VSID, a game that assesses different skills like perspective taking, self-efficacy, but most importantly, social problem solving. And in this game, people embody the avatar of a student in the class, in the school, sorry, and they have to navigate through the classroom, through recess, interacting with colleagues and teachers, and they have to solve social conflicts and social issues. So seeing how then they navigate through that, we can infer skills on social problem solving. So what are the different, globally different strengths and challenges that we found in these innovative tools? We know that tasks collectively are very comprehensive in that they cover multiple social and emotional skills. And since they have a simple interface, it's easy to and efficient to extract data. And a lot of them have robust reliability and validity psychometrics. Now, of course, as a setback, because they are simple or simpler, the stimuli and context is also more simple. And so they have some difficulty in representing multifaceted constructs, and they overlook some richness of how we manifest social and emotional skills in real life. Digital games, on the other hand, being more complex, they have storytelling, richer audiovisual elements, more immersiveness and interactivity. And they can, because there's a story, they can have multiple narratives and assess multiple skills at the same time or through the same gameplay experience. And they also have this stealth assessment characteristic, which means that while you're playing the game, you don't really feel you're being tested. As a setback, they take more time to administer, they're more costly to develop, they're not as tested because they are usually newer developments, and the complexity of these games and the cognitive load can generate data that is more complex to interpret, so more noise in this data. So what are the key messages I want to communicate so that we can also link this to the conversation with our panel? Is that the assessment tools overall offer rich and diverse design. So we have a lot of tools we can use to assess different skills, but these have very distinct levels of quality in terms of their psychometric properties. Very important is that they were developed for different purposes. So different tools were developed for research purposes, clinical purposes, for example, to help the diagnosis of neuropsychiatric populations, and also educational purposes where the assessment purpose was linked with training. So because they were developed specifically, it conditions their ability to be directly applied to other contexts. So for example, when teachers come to us and ask us, can we use this tool in my class? It's hard for us to give that direct recommendation unless strict validation has been set to that specific context. So even though many tools or many tasks in particular have solid validation, the majority does not offer large-scale validation comparing systems or countries, and because they lack this testing in terms of sufficiently representative samples. And so finally, the last message is quite obvious. We need more research and more validation before we can proceed to classroom level and system level implementation of these different assessment tools. So I will stop my sharing now, and I will ask the first question, just give me a second, to Ellen. So thinking about all these messages and these tools we presented, and given the wide range of possibilities for innovative assessment that we have now available, I'm curious to understand whether you consider that these are interesting measurements to be applicable now, and whether Templeton is interested in supporting these innovations, especially these games and tasks, which are still in the early stages of development, to help them scale up.
Thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. So just very briefly, Templeton World Charity Foundation, we tend to support innovative projects that are looking to push the boundaries of scientific knowledge and help people flourish. Within that, SEL and character is a core focus. And as a private philanthropic foundation, I think foundations like Templeton and others are actually really well positioned to fund some of these sort of riskier, earlier stage development of tools and measures, which then once an evidence base is generated, can be taken up by some of your larger institutional funders or sort of even education systems, et cetera. So in that sense, I think it very much hits the sweet spot for many private foundations. And in the past, TWCF has funded research into SEL measurement. Mostly it's been in the context of sort of developing self-report measures that are appropriate to a specific cultural context, because it can also often be a challenge when you're importing tools from one area to another in order to try and measure the same construct. But we have also been funding some of these earlier stage initiatives. For example, in Nigeria, we're supporting Eugene Ohu and colleagues at Lagos Business School who have developed a virtual reality game where students can immerse themselves and take the perspective of somebody from a different ethnic group from themselves in order to, essentially walk in the shoes or visualize the world through their perspective. And so yeah, I think in general, sort of private philanthropy can be a really great partner in terms of taking these types of initiatives forward.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear about the VR investment in virtual reality, and Adriana will be discussing that later. That increases that sense of immersiveness, so it helps with perspective taking. So very good to hear that you're supporting this already, and also the issue of cultural adaptability, which is a concern we also heard from different stakeholders. I would bring Clemens now he has a lot of technical expertise in research, so I would try to use his knowledge to this question. So how do you see these innovations that I presented, which focus mostly on direct assessment, of course? How do they complement the information that is offered by the current self-reports? And again, linked with this, how are your thoughts on the need to balance the increasing complexity of design audiovisual stimuli that makes these tasks complex with the need to also ensure clean, valid, reliable collection of data?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I applaud you for putting together this very thorough review and overview of the existing assessments. I think your review shows that there's a lot out there that most people in the field may not have been aware of, simply because how diverse the various fields working on this are. And it's now great that we have this overview of almost 60 different direct assessments of different social and emotional skills. I think that's a very important step forward. Compared to cognitive skills, where we have a very long tradition of very well crafted and validated assessments, such as the OECD's own assessments of literacy, numeracy, complex problem solving. The assessment of social and emotional skills, or as Ellen already said, social emotional learning, has been lagging behind, in the sense that until just a few years ago, we mostly were and still are relying on self-reports or other reports, where students in a questionnaire rate their own skills on verbal rating skills, or parents or teachers would do the same, reporting about students. And this is great, it's very effective, and it's also very efficient. They are able to predict certain outcomes, such as school achievement, bullying, school dropout, and a lot of other academic and life outcomes from such self-report scales. However, it is very clear that they do not really capture what students are actually able to do. They just capture what students say they're able to do. And there's an important difference between self-concepts and actual real-world behavior. And now what these direct assessments do is move us closer to assessing actual behavior in dynamic environment that resemble very closely the real-world situations and tasks that students would encounter. And that is a question of ecological validity, but it is also a question of acceptability. So test takers are much more likely to accept that these tests actually measure the skills and behaviors that we claim they measure, simply because they see how closely these scenarios and games resemble the real world past. Also importantly, we now move much closer to assessing maximum performance or maximum behavior in a testing situation, rather than a blend of what people think they typically do or might be able to do. So those are all important steps forward. And I think the challenge that you outlined is the one we need to resolve. And the challenge is this: it takes much longer to put students through a series of games or gamified assessments than just to present them with a list of 100 or so items where they can rate themselves. So what that means is we have a certain conflict of interest. On the one hand, we want to assess a broad profile of social and emotional skills, because there are so many, according to the OECD's own framework and according to many other frameworks, that we might potentially assess. On the other hand, we can probably only deep dive and zoom in on a few select skills that we then assess through direct assessments, in addition to the self-reports or other reports from parents and teachers. So at the moment, given where we are in the development and validation of these assessments, I see them as a complement to the existing self-reports that allows us to zoom in on a few selected skills that we deem particularly important and want to assess through more than just self-reports. But I don't see them yet as a fully fledged replacement for the traditional rating scale-based assessments.
Thank you. Thank you, Clemens. Yes, it's very much aligned with the OECD work of finding a way to use complementary strategies rather than a full replacement. And that's a very good point about having a criteria and choosing a few selected promising skills rather than trying to reach everything, since, for example, in our framework, we've contemplated more than 20 different skills. So it can be challenging to have tasks and games for all of them and apply them in an effective manner. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Adriano, who will introduce the work of our team in the more advancement technologies, which identified and discussed these advanced methods to assess social and emotional skills. Adriano.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'll share my screen, so let me know if it works. Can you see it? Is it working?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So yeah, as Daniel was saying, another section of our working paper focuses on new technological approaches that can transversally be applied to different tasks and games to improve assessment. We reviewed these technologies according to 4 broad categories, knowing that these categories are not mutually exclusive. And the first category we reviewed is about technologies gathering biophysiological measures or biodata. So human behaviors and abilities can be measured through methods that track biological and physiological data, such as heart rate, eye movements, or cortisol levels, a stress hormone in hair or saliva. These spontaneous implicit data can complement traditional assessments by providing more direct insights into the emotional states of the participants. We also reviewed virtual reality and augmented reality. So VR immerses users in digital 3D environments completely, while augmented reality overlays digital information onto images of the real world. Both VR and AR are increasingly accessible and applied in education. They provide interactive and immersive learning experiences by enabling activities like virtual reality field trips or interactive 3D simulations of scientific concepts, or real-time augmented visualization in classrooms. All of these activities can foster engagement and creativity among students. We looked then at artificial intelligence applications. So AI technologies for assessing social emotional skills utilizes complex algorithms techniques to analyze verbal and written communication, to analyze facial expressions, body language, in order to identify social cues and emotions. These technologies offer 3 main applications: designing interactive tasks using generative AI, analyzing emotional states with predictive AI, and inferring skills from diverse data sources. While these applications are extremely promising, this field is very rapidly evolving, with potential for enhancing assessment realism and efficiency, though it remains very early in development for social emotional skills assessment. Finally, we also looked at tools that use digital footprints and behavioral measures for video games. Digital footprints are digital traces that people leave across platforms like social media and forums, either passively or actively. These traces are used to infer personality traits and leadership skills, for example, and they offer a very cost-effective way to assess social emotional skills. The other source of data is video gaming. So recent video games with narrative and choice-driven gameplay allow players to make impactful decisions that influence characters and outcomes, which provides detailed behavioral data for assessing social emotional skills in a very immersive and engaging manner. Now, let's see some of the strengths and challenges of these 4 categories. Well, I won't have much time, so I'll just pick a few, and the rest you can read them in the paper, of course. So biodata, or biophysiological measures, they are extremely adaptable. So many of these techniques can be very adapted and integrated into already existing tasks and games. And of course, this data is spontaneous, so it's less subject to conscious alteration or desirability bias, for example. Challenges related to these techniques is that biodata is complex, and correlation with specific emotions and social emotional skills is not linear or easy to interpret. Also, this data is strongly affected by multiple factors such as stress levels, sleep, food intake, or innate circadian rhythms. VR and AR offer great levels of immersiveness with contextualized social information, richer audiovisual stimuli when compared to tasks or games presented in 2D. And in these situations, participants report very strong levels of engagement and high sense of presence, which can foster motivation, so potentially optimize data collection. The negative aspects is, of course, the current use of VR and AR is targeting mostly learning purposes, much more than assessment. And of course, equipment costs, which is less than before, but it's still quite expensive. So it can limit visibility of these technologies in a large-scale assessment context. Finally, artificial intelligence and digital footprints and behavioral measures from video games. These technologies and these approaches can strongly improve assessment design while reducing costs and time of development with generative AI, for example. AI can also quickly and accurately analyze large amounts of data from text, gaze, facial expression, gesture, or speech. But applications, as I was saying, are still being developed, so clear validation studies are not always yet available. And AI suffers from strong biases related to culture, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, etc. In short, these new technologies provide powerful tools for better data analysis and broader data sources, but the cost-benefit trade-off of some of these technologies compared to traditional assessments remains unproven. Interpreting data and relating it to actual skills is often complex. There are ethical concerns, particularly in educational context, regarding the use and the storage of data. And last but not least, open access validation research is absolutely essential for classroom and system level implementation. So I'll stop sharing now and I'll turn to Rose for my first question. As AI becomes more integrated into education and society, how can we protect children and education from potential challenges in using AI for social emotional assessment or in general, while maximizing its benefits for learning? In other words, considering these advancements, are you more hopeful or concerned about the future of AI in education?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. And like Clemens, I just want to say this is an excellent paper, extremely useful and very thorough. So thank you so much for producing the paper. I think it's a fantastic resource. It is a tricky question. I mean, there are challenges for using AI innovation in education in general. And then I think there are more when it comes to assessment. So obviously we need to be really careful about the robustness of the design of the AI that we're using. Now, in the paper, you talk about AI being used to design tasks, to do analysis, and then to infer by analyzing data that's been collected for a different purpose. Now, the last two are quite different to the first, but they all bring challenges. So with the first, which is the designing the task, you know, there's a concern about accuracy there, of course, as ever with generative AI, and therefore reliability. There's also a concern, as you raise in the paper yourselves, about cultural sensitivity that would need to be looked at carefully. Obviously, we're super careful not to enter private information about individual students into a generative AI tool, but that's not the instance in the example that you've used of designing the study. When it comes to analysing, then of course we are treating sensitive data. So we need to be more cautious to make sure that that data is being treated with respect, stored carefully, privacy respected, that the algorithms that are being used to process that data are well designed and informed by existing research and evidence about the particular social emotional skill that's being assessed. But also, as you've already pointed out, that the data on which the tool has been trained is not biased, that it's representative of the children whose assessment is being conducted through this analysis. And that's another problem when it comes to inferring, because we need to make sure that the data that hasn't been collected specifically for the purpose of assessment is relevant. So there's lots of challenges when using AI in general. And we certainly need to make sure that we look very carefully at the person who is offering the assessment. And sometimes that's difficult as well, because they can be private companies, and perhaps the information about their research base or exactly how the technology works is not as open and transparent as we would like. And that might be the case with a research tool. So yes, certainly lots of challenges, but there's also a lot of potential in these tools, as you point out. You know, the potential to capture a rich data set about particular behavior patterns and use tools like artificial intelligence, I think brings a lot of potential, but it's quite early days. And we need to develop that research base so that we can be sure that the particular tools are doing what we want them to do and that they will be likely to be reliable.
Thank you so much, Rose. And it's very interesting that you bring up this question about data protection, as only less than a year ago, I think, the first legislation on AI was proposed by the European Union. And we really hope that now it started a new generation where we realize the importance of like ensuring data protection in this from so around with policies that really look into this issue in order to develop and foster research, but in a very controlled and safe context.
Absolutely.
I turn to Clemens, given your direct involvement in developing these AI assessment instruments. How do you incorporate the concerns that Rose raised about ethical and data issues, especially when covering social emotional skills? So do you challenge any of Rose's views? Do you mostly agree with these concerns? And how do you work with these?
Absolutely agree with Rose. And I think it depends very much on the purpose for which these assessments are being used. In my case, we're often designing assessments for learners who are adult learners in corporate contexts. And that to me is very different from assessing youth, students, whether that is for international comparison studies, such as the ones that OECD runs, or for other purposes. I think it depends very much on the use case, what kind of requirements we have as to transparency, the ability to opt in or out when it comes to data sharing, etc. For all research purposes and purposes of assessing students in large-scale assessments, I agree with Rose that I think transparency is key. So students and their parents and also other stakeholders like the schools would need to know what research went into the assessment, what is the validation status of the assessment, so can they trust it? What assumptions are behind it? For example, which values and norms influence the scoring, particularly important for social emotional skills that are not like a math test where there's a simple right or wrong, but that are culturally situated. They're really embedded in the fabric of our values, norms, and how we score them, what we consider good behavior or bad behavior, really is based on our values and social norms. So it's very important to make those transparent, especially if you think about assessing people from diverse cultures or subcultures within a society. So that I think is key. And then so personally, I believe very firmly is that we want to avoid the situation that we ran into with cognitive skills, where, reminiscent of that Bernstein-Murray bell curve debate, assessments were used to rank and sort individuals, but also even more strongly to stereotype individuals and social groups. And I think it will be very important going forward that social and emotional skills assessments remain close to the idea of social and emotional learning. So primarily, we will use them as formative assessments rather than summative assessments, meaning we embed them. So essentially, they're not just assessments, they're also learning tools where students can learn from the feedback that they get out of these assessments. And that to me is key in avoiding that the progress in assessing social and emotional skills leads to whatever interest group misusing or abusing these new tools to rank and sort students in a way that is undesirable, I think, for society.
Thank you. It's extremely interesting, and I would like now maybe to open the floor to everybody. So I welcome an open discussion, and feel free to intervene if you want. Something that comes up quite a lot in what we reviewed with Daniel is that we lack access to validation. So Clemens, you were pointing out validation data for those tools, and Rose too. And Ellen, of course, you're working with these new technologies. So the issue we had in this review is that we lack access to those validation studies. We lack sometimes access to the data to consider whether a privately owned tool has been trained correctly, has been tested correctly. So it's very difficult to infer from what's out there sometimes whether a tool is actually something that's safe to be used in an educational context. So maybe we can open the floor. I'll open the floor, and maybe Ellen, I have a question for you regarding this. Do you work with tools that have been developed by private companies? And if yes, how do you, or if you develop your own tools, do you give access to these validation data so that researchers can actually see how this has been tested and on which population, if there are biases in cultural, for example, cultural biases, etc.?
Thanks. These are really important questions. So first, just to clarify, Templeton as a foundation, we're strictly a funder. So we don't actually do any in-house development. We give grants to sort of academics, NGOs, or in some cases, private companies to develop tools. But the way that we try to sort of address this issue of transparency is having a very solid sort of open access research policy. So, there's a very strong trend, obviously, in the research space about the importance of publishing findings in openly available journals that, you don't need to pay a subscription to, so that anyone in the world, regardless of your affiliation, can have access to the information. And with that comes a requirement to ensure that, the de-identified data sets are available to anyone who might be interested. So if anyone's looking to sort of use the tools or measurement instruments that are developed through TWCF funding, they have access to essentially the background, what happened beforehand. So I think that's a really important trend. And I don't know how much it has sort of gone into, I guess, the private sphere of development. I can speak more towards sort of research and academia, but I think that's an important trend. The other, I guess, point I wanted to pick up on was sort of the importance of ensuring that, I guess, there's a cultural validation component, and that, again, these tools are developed based on information coming from the populations that they aim to serve. Again, sort of as a funder being a few steps away, one of the ways that we sort of aim to ensure, I guess, that there's greater cultural grounding is by most of our funds will flow directly to researchers and organizations that are working in the countries and communities where the research and development is taking place. And so those types of partnerships, I think, are really important to ensure that there is a grounding in sort of the cultural, the social context, and that those nuances are picked up on.
Thank you. It's very clear. I don't know if Clemence or Rose, you wanna say something about this or pick up on something Ellen said.
Yes, I think the transparency is a super important point, and I agree with what Ellen has said. I think there's another element to this that we need to be careful of when it comes to consumerization, because what we're seeing with the consumerization of AI in general is some quite worrying rhetoric with respect to people such as ourselves who are concerned with learning. We see that these tools are going to be effortless to use. Everything's about ease of use, which is not positive for those of us who want to learn, because learning involves strenuous mental effort. So we're already seeing that rhetoric. I think we have to worry about what the imperative of the AI is when it comes to assessment. Yes, of course, it's to assess, but why is that assessment being done? Clemence raised this point earlier. We need to be transparent about that imperative as well, because if there's a risk that it's being done for stereotyping or privilege in particular communities, which you can imagine in a commercial sense could be the case. So I think there's a need for that transparency when it comes to the imperative, as well as when it comes to publishing data and publishing exactly what's going on, being transparent about that. That imperative piece, I think, is also important.
I do agree, and I think so. It's both it's more of a question, but do you sense a resistance about incorporating these innovation in education, which seems to be relevant also because people seems to be, or people in community seems to be more and more conscious about these potential issues and challenges, and so it seems to have a negative impact on the implementation of these tools, even the ones that could be safe to use or that could be useful to implement, because there are these concerns, and it feels like sometimes these concerns are not addressed loudly or loudly enough in the public space.
I think that's true. And I think addressing them is complicated, because what is transparent for one person may not be for another. We hear a lot about understandable AI or making it easy for people to interpret what's going on, transparency. But that depends on the level of understanding of the individual themselves. And so sometimes the recipient, what seems transparent to us is not transparent to the recipient. So I think there's an issue there. At the moment, because there's so much hype with respect to AI, I think you get people having a knee-jerk reaction that can be negative or positive, actually. It can go either way. But yes, I think when it comes to assessment, because assessment is a very important, highly weighted thing, isn't it? It makes a huge difference to the person who's being assessed what that result is. I think the knee-jerk reaction against is stronger. So that I think we need to look carefully about what we mean by transparency and how we make sure that the people who might be having a negative reaction really do understand what is happening. And therefore, we need to be very clear that what is happening is ethical.
Clemens?
I've done a lot of user testing in the past 5 years in 3 companies that I worked in which we had AI assessments and learning interventions. And it's very polarized. That's very interesting. So on the one hand, there are people who are completely opposed to anything related to AI for the very reason that there's this hype that Rose, I think, aptly described, and a lot of discussions that highlight the risks of AI. So people have some people, it's not a small group, have grown averse to anything that involves AI, and they will just not accept assessments that involve AI. On the other hand, I have heard quite a few voices of learners or test takers who are very happy with being assessed by AI because they believe that it is more objective than being assessed by a human. So it is at the moment very polarized. And I think it will, so 2 to 5 years from now, I hope that this whole hype around AI will have subsided a bit and that we probably don't even need the term AI, because it is quite a broad umbrella term, as Rose has already pointed out. What do we mean by AI? Do we mean generative AI, such as large language models, for a role play interaction? Or do we mean AI for analytics, processing large amounts of text, for example, coming out of a role play and doing text classification on it? So those are very different use cases. And I think depending on the use case, acceptance will be higher or lower. And ultimately, I hope we can just do away with the buzzwords and be more specific about what it is, what it actually does, what happens to the data, etc. Everything we just discussed before.
I don't know if Daniel? Yeah.
I would like to go back just to one point that Clemens made before, not in this answer, the answer before, where you said we should focus the use of these assessment tools to formative assessment rather than summative assessment to avoid selection and creating a stereotype of students. Although some countries already use some form of summative use of this information, like assessing, for example, communication skills during presentations or collaborative work when delivering a final project. Since we'll probably have more of these innovative tools in the future, how would you argue against summative assessment, or would you think, depending on specific skills, not others, for example, collaborative work might be more meaningful, not empathy, not so much? What are your thoughts on this? And of course, I welcome the panel to give your perspective on this formative versus summative discussion. Thank you.
Just to be very clear, I'm not at all against summative assessments. I just think if we're assessing student populations, we should always give them a chance to learn from assessments and ideally offer them ways of improving their skills after the assessment. And this is for 2 reasons. One is a principal reason. I think especially in youth or adolescents, the level of plasticity of people is very high, so they can learn. And the second relates more to the nature and the validation status of the assessments. I have not seen very many direct assessments of social and emotional skills where, from a psychometrics perspective, I feel confident enough that we could use them to grade, rank, and sort individuals, for the simple reason that the key requirement of obtaining accurate estimates of someone's skills, namely reliability, or in item response theory, the standard error, is not fulfilled for most of these assessments. They are not validated to the extent that you would be confident to use them in a summative assessment context. And that applies to very many of the 60 that you have reviewed.
Very true. Yes. Rose or Alan, do you want to comment on the different ways to apply these assessments? Whether you find them more useful to one end or the other? No?
Yeah, no, I think Clemens makes some really important points there. And I would add that, of course, it does depend a bit on exactly what is being assessed. There are, I think, more tensions when it comes to emotion recognition or facial expression recognition than perhaps they are with text analysis, for example, both of which are forms of assessment for AI that AI can conduct. But for multiple reasons, not least that the accuracy rates for emotion and facial expression assessment vary widely, and the evidence base is not particularly solid in many instances. But also, I think there is obviously an emotional reaction that makes you more likely to feel doubtful about AI being used, I think, for those kind of very personal assessments of things like your emotions. So it's a complicated space, isn't it? It's very complicated, and I don't think you can kind of see AI for assessment, summative or formative, in one pot, because there's so many different forms of AI assessment, different forms of data, and they each come with their complexity. Sorry, that's a really academic answer, isn't it? It's a kind of, it's complicated answer, but it's true.
Yes, it's very good, and it obviously reflects reality. So it's better to have to acknowledge these nuances that rather than have very simplistic responses, especially in such an important topic. Adriana, sorry if you want to continue.
Ellen wanted to intervene, I think.
Sure, I was going to add a comment. It takes the conversation in a slightly different direction, so apologies for that. But I think one question that sort of we as a community of people interested in sort of these issues also needs to ask is sort of to what extent are we equipping sort of researchers, teachers, students, anyone who is potentially interacting with these tools with, you know, in many ways, the socio-emotional skills and competencies that we need to engage with them in a productive way and in a critical way, because sort of skepticism is not the same as critical thinking or judgment or perspective taking. So, you know, in many ways, it takes us full circle to the importance of socio-emotional learnings and socio-emotional processes in innovation and technology. It presents new challenges, it presents new skills. And I think that there's often a lack of sort of critical engagement of the extent to which people from different communities are equipped to engage in sort of a productive way. And I think that that's a really sort of interesting area of exploration, especially when it comes to children and youth.
It's an excellent point. And actually, we were very positively surprised when we did the review, because we found some tools that actually do not use AI to assess social emotional skills, but do assess social emotional skills in the context of AI interactions. And for example, creativity, which is a social emotional cognitive skill, let's say, has been tested. So they have developed, and the CREA tool, the CREA suite that Daniel presented, it has one of the tools they're developing. It's I forgot the country of the team, sorry. So I'm sorry. But they are developing a tool basically where they measure the ability, creativity, production of a person interacting with an AI tool they developed. And it's very interesting because it changes the question, right? It's not anymore about just having social emotional skills. It's about having social emotional skills and implementing those skills in a world where AI will at some point take a major importance, and whether these tools will be everywhere in our work context, but are already there in our social context. When we look at, for example, social media that uses algorithms to produce or select our feeds and select what we're looking at. So I agree with you, Ellen. It's very important to now go beyond this question of what are these tools, what are social emotional skills, and start considering what are the social emotional skills we need to interact with those tools, and how can we also start measuring these abilities and develop these abilities in children and students. I'm mindful of time. I don't know, Clemens, you want to add something? Yeah.
I just want to add something that we will not be able to resolve through any technology, and that is very important to bear in mind. I've briefly alluded to it before. And for social and emotional skills, it's very important to bear in mind that they are very culturally laden. So the social norms, values, and beliefs of a society and community are very important in determining what we believe is optimal behavior, what it means to be at a high level of a skill. And since antiquity, and that's not only true in Western culture, but also if you look at Chinese philosophy, Confucius or Mencius, there was the idea that it's always about a certain optimal region in the middle of two extremes, the golden mean, that idea. So it's not the case for social and emotional skills, or I can come up with very few examples where more is necessarily better. You want to strike a balance. And you want to be able, as a student learner, to know when to take what action. So this idea of meta-regulation, being able to recognize, read situations, and select appropriate behaviors according to also beliefs, values, and social norms is very important. And I do not see this kind of thinking, which is foundation to a lot of the authors in research on character strength, a related area, reflected in the AI tools that we have at our disposal. I think what it means is two things. One is, let's not make it too simplistic when we assess skills. Let's be mindful that more is not always better, and that the situation matters, reading the situation, selecting behaviors in a situation, not just carrying out certain behaviors. And the second is, I think we need to give communities some control over what they count as desirable behavior or undesirable behavior attached to a certain skill, and that may be very different. So leadership, for example, or consoling someone, being socially warm, will express itself very different in different communities and cultures. And that is something that I would like to see reflected in the future tools that are being developed.
You're on mute, Daniel.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, had a problem with the camera. Thanks, Daniel. So maybe we, Clemens. So maybe I don't know, Noemi, if you're listening to us.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, maybe we can pick a question from the chat.
Yes, thank you so much for all the questions in the chat. There were a couple of questions about how to best give feedback to students. What are the best practices for incorporating real-time feedback in the assessment of social emotional skills? And there was also another question about AI being seen as a tool that can reduce teachers' workloads, especially in regards to giving feedback. So again, there was a question about what are the mechanisms that could be put in place to ensure that feedback does no harm. So I think this was more in the context of formative assessment, and perhaps we could elaborate a little bit more on that. Any reaction from the panel on this? Any tool that has successfully incorporated like real-time feedback to your knowledge, or any tips how to do that?
So I don't know about the real-time feedback tools, but I think when we're trying to think about sort of how students or youth will be reacting to engagement. Again, I think it comes down to sort of what stage are they at in their development, and to what extent do they have the opportunity to be self-reflexive about, how does it feel after engaging in this process? And I think simply providing people with the space and the tools to think about, okay, I've just gone through a battery of assessments. What has this brought up for me? How am I feeling after playing this game for X amount of time. I think that in some ways is very much back to basics when it comes to sort of psychological development is to provide that opportunity for sort of reflexive engagement and growth, and then the opportunity for feedback. If there's going to be some type of harm or some type of sort of negative experience that has come up with it, to ensure that the students and youth are within a framework and a network that ensures that they have the opportunity to resolve that. So I think in that sense, we sort of just go back to the basics of good research principles and encouraging sort of agency, self-reflexivity, et cetera. And that will depend on the age group, what is most appropriate.
Thank you so much, Ellen. There were also many questions about methods to address the ethical concerns. I know we have touched a bit upon that during the webinar, but there were quite a few questions around this, and a very recent question, which I can read out loud: what methodologies can be used to ensure that assessment tools do not favor one cultural group over another? So maybe a question to Clemence and to Rose, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
I go first, Rose?
Sure, you go first, Clemens.
Oh, I go. So in the traditional psychometric toolbox, we would test whether items or test tasks function differently in different groups and favor certain groups over others. And I would imagine that we could do the same for any direct assessment that involves AI. In addition to that, there's specific ways of testing the AI models under the hood with different stimuli. So, for example, if you do computer vision of pictures, of faces, you could have a test database comprising faces from different ethnic groups, and then you could see whether the model output favors or disfavors one or more of these groups. So there's ways to ensure that they are bias-free that are very similar to the classic psychometric toolbox. However, we are still dealing with probabilistic models, meaning the output is not fixed. There's a certain probability that they will give a certain output given a certain input, such as a picture of a face or an emotional expression. So there is no real way with AI models that use neural networks under the hood. There's no real way of guaranteeing that nothing goes wrong during the analysis phase. And that's something we might have to accept if we use that kind of technology. And then I think the steps that Ellen also mentioned, giving test takers or learners the ability to give feedback, to report things going wrong is of critical importance, because it's then about guaranteeing that the assessment experience is not negative and that learners or test takers have a voice.
I think that's so important. I agree completely, Clemens, that and Ellen's point about giving the person who's being assessed a voice, giving people confidence, particularly with AI, to challenge it.
Excuse me, Rose, I'm mindful of time, just so you know, 1 minute, and then we have to close because they really cut the video. So please go, just so you know.
No, that's fine. I was just at that point, just on the question of feedback. I think there's a real tension here because a lot of tools are being developed to give feedback, formative feedback. And you can see the tension between the need to give speedy feedback to students so they get it in a timely manner in terms of learning, but the tensions that Ellen raised as well about making sure that that feedback is accurate and useful and actually genuinely what's required.
Thank you so much, Rose. So I'm mindful of time. We are arriving at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much to all of you. I wanted to close with a very, it's not an easy question, but really if you can give an answer in 30 seconds to a minute, just to close this topic. What are your expectations in terms of major development in the next 2 to 5 years for the use of these innovative approaches? If you have 2.1, it can be it can be a promise or something you see as a major change in the upcoming years. Maybe you want to start, Clemens?
I think we're going to move away from testing in artificial testing situation to ingesting a lot of digital traces that people leave as in their lives as they use digital systems. So email, Slack, TikTok, whatever digital systems they use, leave a trace. And those traces can be used as signals that are also informative about their skills. And there are already commercial providers in the market that do just this for adult learners. And I'm hoping we can see similar skills inferencing engines, as they are called, for student learners that are then available for non-commercial purposes.
Okay, so digital footprints. Ellen?
So what I think, or I hope that we'll see in future, is more diverse data sets, and more data that can guide the development of populations, different subpopulations. I think that's going to be a key driver.
Thank you. So cultural diversified data sets. Rose?
I think it's one thing to think about what's technically possible, and I agree with Clemens about the digital traces. There's a huge amount of work in this area, but I'm not sure how socially acceptable that's going to be. I think more people are becoming concerned about surveillance as they see it. So I think it's going to be interesting to see the tension between social acceptance and technology possibility.
Thanks a lot for these closing remarks, and thank you again for being here. I thank everybody who followed us. And again, as Daniel said, we'll send you an email afterwards with the presentation and the links to the webinar and the paper, of course.
Thank you
so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Much.